Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at more Sega Saturn exclusives. These games could not be played on any other console hardware during that era. So, let's take a look at 8 more Sega Saturn exclusives. Capcom would bless Saturn owners with a late port of their Dungeons & Dragons arcade games in Japan only in March of 1999. It would contain both the CPS2 powered arcade games Dungeons & Dragons Tower of Doom, as well as Dungeons & Dragons Shadow over Mystara. Using the 4MB RAM expansion cart to bring you as close a home port as humanly possible at the time, these games shined at a time of utter despair for Saturn owners. Dreamcast had been launched, Saturn third parties had all abandoned the machine, and even Sega themselves had left the system to rot in the one region where it had claimed its only success. Yet here was Capcom to the rescue with one of the machine's final must-owns. 2 beat-em-ups with fantastic graphics and music, play mechanics beyond the typical button mashing, and co-op multiplayer from the gods. The first game in the collection is Tower of Doom, originally released in the arcades in 1993. You'll choose one of 4 adventurers sent to investigate various areas beset by monster attacks. As the story unfolds, you learn of the origin of the evil and set out to destroy it. Graphics here are stunningly drawn, with great color and animation coming together to create a world truly worth playing in. Matching the gorgeous graphics is the AAA music score, worthy of its own OST. It pulls everything together, and I found myself at times simply wanting to stop and listen to the track play out, as it was so incredibly good. Don't mess around too much enjoying the sights and sounds though, as this game is difficult the first few times you play it, and you'll want to play it multiple times to see the complete game, as the story presents you with options that will change your path and send you to different stages. This increases the replay value of an already infinitely playable game incredibly. Now, because the game was Japan only, the story is of course in Japanese, so find you a good walkthrough so you know what the hell is going on and what those choices actually mean. I cannot recommend Tower of Doom enough. It's a fantastic beat-em-up hybrid with light RPG elements and great fun for 2 players. Which leads us into our second game in the collection, Shadow over Mystara, originally released in the arcades in 1996. This direct sequel continues to follow our adventurers from Tower of Doom, also adding 2 new heroes to the mix. After moving on from the events of the first game, they come to realize that they had only scratched the surface of the problems that had ailed the lands, and they must of course follow it to its conclusion. Take everything I just said about Tower of Doom and apply it here. The game looks and sounds absolutely fantastic, with even better color, backgrounds, and animation rounding out its awesome arcade presentation. Even the gameplay has seen some advancement, with new moves and items to help you along the way. You also get the same multipath story choices the first game had, adding that replayability we all need. In the end, if I had to fire off some criticisms of these games, it's the frequent and long loading times you'll encounter as you play. Stages tend to be short, and you see now loading a ton of times. It's even worse in the second game, as sometimes the gameplay itself will freeze to load the next part of the level, breaking up the ebb and flow of the action. These games also lack the 4-player co-op of the arcade games, only allowing you 2 players. It doesn't ruin anything, but man, I would have loved seeing the Saturn put all that stuff on the screen. In the end though, we are left with 2 fantastic ports of 2 awesome arcade games that only the Sega Saturn could have given us. It's a bit pricey these days, but considering the 2 classics contained within, they're well worth the money in my opinion. Early 1998 would see the release of the classic Model 2 arcade rail shooter, House of the Dead. I covered this game under one of my first videos, Bad Sega Saturn Ports. There, I strongly presented my opinion that the technical showing of this game is highly disappointing. Sega decided to go with an outside team for this port, and it was plainly obvious that development time was rushed, almost certainly by the impending release of the Sega Dreamcast. Everything about this game's graphical presentation is a massive letdown. The frame rate is poor, the textures are god-awful, there's glitches everywhere, and the polygon counts are woefully low. The lone bright spot in its presentation is the soundtrack, which has a great flow to it that matches the action every step of the way. House of the Dead also makes up quite a bit of ground with its content, which despite the abysmal graphics, still manages to be fun with great replayability. The atmosphere still manages to hold on to much of the arcade's B-movie feel, something that made the game wholly unique at the time. Its multipath gameplay also gives you a reason to come back and see the different areas you missed before. There are also additional modes, including customizable Sega Saturn mode that allows you to adjust a bunch of the content, as well as a boss rush mode that allows you to test your skills against all the game's baddies. Any seasoned gamer will tell you that graphics do not make a game, and that's never been more true than here. House of the Dead on the Saturn is an awful looking game that still manages to be fun and well worth picking up. Be sure to look for the Japanese version if you want it, as the Western releases of this game are well past reasonably priced. T&E Soft would develop the infamous Virtua Hideout for the Saturn, where it saw release in early 1995. A remake of the original game, the player is tasked with rescuing the princess from the clutches of the evil Viralis. You begin the game with little in the way of equipment, and the first thing that hits you square in the face is the horrific graphical presentation. My god, is it awful. It makes the aforementioned House of the Dead look like the best looking Saturn game ever made. I mean, this game is visually utterly broken. It runs in slideshow format the entire time, and the awful sprite work is some of the worst I've ever seen. And just when you think it can't get any worse, you enter a confined space or an area with heavy detail, and bam! The frame rate plummets even more, and the camera goes crazy on you. This essentially means that the game never ever lets you enjoy anything you are seeing, pummeling you with visuals that make 3DO and Jaguar games look exotic. Of course, thanks to the bad frame rate and camera, the game plays poorly too. There's no depth perception at all, meaning combat is painful to endure. And speaking of combat, unlike the original game, defeating enemies no longer levels you up. To gain levels in the game, you must complete objectives. So stopping to fight anything in the overworld is completely useless. Why create an overworld full of enemies that give you no reason to engage them? The lone bright spot of the game is the randomly chosen presets for the overworld and dungeons. This means you pretty much can't play the same layout twice, but when a game is this bad, who the hell cares about replayability? Shin Shinobi Den, or Shinobi Legions in the US and Shinobi X in Europe, was released exclusively for the Saturn in mid-1995. You take control of Sho, a ninjutsu master who must rescue his mentor's daughter from his own brother, Kazuma. The 16-bit Shinobi games had all been instant classics, with each one refining the former's gameplay and honing it to perfection. By the time Shinobi 3 would land, the series was at its high point, and was as good as any action platformer had ever been. Here is where Shin Shinobi Den takes the majority of its cues, essentially copying that game's mechanics with very little change. No matter though, because Shinobi 3 is a damn fine game to pull inspiration from, and this game is all the better for it. Graphically, the game is quite decent looking, with great enemy variety and varied levels. The soundtrack takes a noticeable hit in atmosphere though, feeling quite alien to the Shinobi universe. Of note to those interested, the European release Shinobi X would have a redone musical score during gameplay. The cheesy full motion video cutscenes feel out of place, but are definitely worth watching just for the laughs. When it's all said and done, the Saturn's take on the classic Shinobi formula feels a tad disjointed and never really sets itself apart from the other games with anything particularly new or unique. The game does play well, however, and since Sega was infamous for leaving some of their best IPs entirely missing on the Saturn, I suppose we are lucky this game showed up at all. Sega Touring Car Championship would be released on the Saturn in late 1997. This port of the arcade Model 2 original ranks right up there with House of the Dead with disappointing graphics. Where Sega Rally excelled with its smooth frame rate and great track graphics, Sega Touring Car falls apart with a hitching, sub 30 frames per second presentation and awful looking textures. The game also has a strange warping effect to its graphics, almost as if you're looking at the game through a distorted lens. This is baffling, as this was a late release on the Saturn, and nearly every other Sega racer on the machine looks and runs better than this. Only the likes of the original Daytona port is comparable, and I even think that looks better than this travesty. Despite hating this game in the past with a passion, I decided to sit down and try and play it and make it work. In the process, I realized some very important things about Sega Touring Car. The game is almost completely broken with the default settings for the standard controller. The developers clearly meant this game to be played with a 3D controller or the Saturn's steering wheel peripheral, and you'll need to heavily modify the car's handling to use a regular pad for any real success in the game. After some trial and error on that end, I was finally able to get a groove with Sega Touring Car, and despite my feelings still being overall negative, there is a racing game here that is worth playing if you put the time in it that it needs. Luckily, it's dirt cheap in Japan and affordable everywhere else. Early 1997 would bring the Saturn one of its most hyped games, Scorcher, published by Scavenger. If you have any age on you at all, you remember Scavenger's games getting a ton of hype for the Sega Saturn for their unique 3D engines. Scorcher here was one of them, grabbing headline after headline for its competent 3D engine that ran smoothly. It's a racing game set in the future, where contestants ride motorbikes around ruined tracks in an effort to be number one. Scorcher starts off with the best intentions, and succeeds early with a great visual presentation and a pumping soundtrack. Seriously, the 3D engine here is super smooth, and the texture work is absolutely among the best on the system. These early levels will allow you to adjust to the game's mechanics, as well as the often crazy physics your cycle will be exposed to. The game begins to become extremely hard about halfway through, where imposing time limits and track layouts that have you falling off the track every other turn begin to add copious amounts of frustration to the proceedings. By the time you reach the final few tracks, there are constant death traps that take extreme skill to even finish, much less even place a rank. Scorcher's legacy is no doubt rooted in the 3D engine that was created for it. Unfortunately, the game itself fails to live up to the promise of something great, though I do still believe the game is worth a purchase. If you can find it at a decent price, pick it up, fire up the time trial, and simply enjoy the speed. The other big hype game from Scavenger was Amok, released in early 1997 as well. This one was boasted as having a voxel-based graphics engine, something not often seen on consoles. This one is essentially a mech third-person shooter with arcade-style controls. You have a variety of weapons at your disposal, where you will be given missions with multiple tasks to complete. Graphics are a mixed bag of smooth frame rates, great enemy sprites, yet blocky terrain that sometimes sticks out like a sore thumb. The soundtrack is grade A goodness, however, and really fits the frantic levels it accompanies. The game is not for those looking for an easy time. This game requires heavy use of the strafe buttons and smart hit and run tactics to get anywhere at all. Get killed in this one and you're looking at the title screen again. No joke, the game pulls no punches and you'll need dedication to see the later levels without cheats. Overall, the game is definitely worth looking at. It runs well, plays well, and will challenge even the most seasoned gamer. It's not a game that I'd rank very high on a Saturn must-have list, but it doesn't cost a fortune, so give it a go for something a bit different. Late 1996 would bring the Saturn an oddball of a game in Vatlava by Ancient. This vehicle combat game uses a top-down perspective and small arenas that allow up to 6 players to compete battle royale style. Vehicles range from small and fast to big and slow, all using various tactics and weapons to their advantage. The top-down viewpoint allows you to see nearly the entire playfield at times, and everything moves along at a great clip. The game also runs in the Saturn's high-res mode, and makes extensive use of VDP2. In fact, it's virtually a tech demo for the Saturn's unique hardware. Gameplay is extremely simple and straightforward. Shoot, launch, and melee the other cars to death before they get you. And with 6-player support, an arena full of your friends can be an absolute blast to play. There is a catch, however. You'll need to get used to one of the various control schemes the game employs, especially if you are using a standard controller. The game also uses a ton of the Saturn's peripherals and add-ons to great effect. There is support for the 6-player adapter, the 3D control pad, the mission stick, the arcade wheel, and even the movie card for advanced cinemas. I highly advise the 3D control pad, as this allows the best control scheme to be used. Surprisingly, this game is still affordable and hasn't been soaked up by collectors yet. Don't let the game's simplicity drive you away. Vatlava is a fun game to play in short bursts, especially with friends. So there we go, folks, more Sega Saturn exclusives. Now luckily some of these games actually have a modern equivalent. Dungeons & Dragons collection, for example, can be gotten on the PC or systems like the Xbox 360, and they look and play great and are super cheap. The Sega Saturn version goes for around $100, making it not so affordable. Luckily, most of these other games in this episode are affordable, or, as in the case of House of the Dead, has a Japanese equivalent that's really inexpensive compared to other regions' versions of that game. So, what did you guys think? Did you like any of these games? Were any of these games worth picking up, you thought? Let me know down in the comments. I am Sega Lord X. I appreciate you guys watching. I'll see you next time.